Call 911, now! What did you do to her?
Here is what you need to know before this story begins. Mara did not grow up asking questions. This was not a failure of intelligence. She had graduated with honors in computer science from a state university that did not offer scholarships to people who were not exceptional. And she had been exceptional. The kind of exceptional that comes from genuinely caring about the work rather than the appearance of caring. She understood systems. She understood the logic of things built to function, and the specific way things built to function eventually reveal the assumptions embedded in their design. What she did not understand, or rather, what she understood and had chosen, for most of her life, not to apply to the people around her, was that people are also systems, that they have embedded assumptions, that the logic of how someone treats you in the first year tells you a great deal about how they will treat you in the fifth, if you are willing to look at it clearly. She had not always been willing to look clearly. Her father had left when she was 4. Not dramatically, no argument, no final confrontation, no door slamming in a way that would give the departure some shape to hold on to. He had simply stopped being there, by increments so gradual that the absence was fully established before it was noticed. And Mara had grown up in a household where the most reliable lesson was this: you did not ask the questions that might make things worse. You found the most generous explanation for whatever was in front of you. You kept the peace, because keeping the peace was how you kept everything else. Her brother Daniel had learned the opposite lesson from the same childhood. She loved him for that, even when it exhausted her. The Whitfield estate in the Connecticut countryside communicated not wealth but rootedness. Not the message of money, but of inevitability, the kind of place that had been standing long enough to seem like it would always stand. Like it had been here before you arrived and would be here long after you were gone. 12 acres, stone perimeter walls with moss growing in the gaps, an oak-lined drive that delivered you to the front entrance at exactly the right pace to feel the weight of what you were walking toward. Eleanor Whitfield had offered them the East Wing 7 months ago. Mara had been 10 weeks pregnant and still in the first careful weeks of telling people, and Eleanor had arrived for Sunday lunch and surveyed the apartment. Mara and Cole shared in the city a genuinely beautiful apartment, large by any standard, with the specific expression of a woman who has decided something and is waiting for the appropriate moment to say it. You need space, Eleanor had said, not unkindly. Nothing, Eleanor said, was unkind in its surface texture. The estate has the East Wing sitting empty, a full medical suite on the ground floor, and Dr. Harmon can be there in 20 minutes from his practice in Westport. He has delivered 3 Whitfield children. He knows our medical history. She had set down her wine glass. It is the practical choice. Mara had looked at Cole. Cole had said, "It's your decision," in the way that people say it when the decision has already been made. She had agreed because Eleanor was trying, and that deserved acknowledgement. She had agreed because the apartment would have been manageable, but the estate had a garden and a library and staff who could help when Cole was traveling. She had agreed because she was 28 years old and 5 months into a marriage and 7 weeks into a pregnancy. And the person offering her a fully staffed wing of an estate was her husband's mother. And Mara did not yet have language for the particular kind of discomfort that had no obvious cause. She had agreed, and they had moved. and the east wing was beautiful, and Eleanor was attentive, and the months had accumulated the way months do when you are waiting for something larger to begin. Today was a Wednesday in October, and Mara was reading on the sofa in the sitting room of the East Wing when Cole appeared in the doorway. She was 26 weeks pregnant. The afternoon light came through the tall windows at the angle that made everything in the room look like it was inside a painting. And she had been reading the same paragraph 3 times because her mind kept sliding sideways toward the baby's movements, which she was still learning to interpret, which she was never going to stop marveling at for as long as she lived. "Dr. Harmon left some notes for you," Cole said. His voice was entirely ordinary, the voice of a man relaying a minor household matter. The sauna. 15 minutes. Low heat, he says it's good for circulation at this stage. Mom asked him specifically to look at your case. Mara looked up from her book. The sauna. "Shouldn't I ask Dr. Chen first?" Harmon's been the family's OB consultant for 20 years. The same voice, the same easy smile. The smile she had fallen in love with before she understood the architecture behind it. "Mom had him review your file personally. Do you want me to call him so he can walk you through it himself?" Mara looked at her husband for a moment. This was the moment she would return to later. The moment when another version of herself, the version that had been quietly assembling for several months, a more honest picture of the life she was living, might have said, "Yes, actually, call him. I want to hear it from him directly, because I have a doctor I trust, and I want to hear her opinion before I do anything relating to this pregnancy." That version existed. She could feel the outline of her. But Mara set down the book and said, "Okay, 15 minutes." Because Eleanor had arranged it out of consideration. Because Cole was smiling in the way she still allowed herself to believe was real. Because Mara had spent 28 years finding the most generous explanation available, and she was not yet ready to stop. The sauna was in the basement level of the main house, at the end of a corridor lined with white marble that had no windows. Cole walked her down. He opened the door, adjusted the settings following, he said, the doctor's instructions, and held the door as she stepped inside. "I'll wait right out here," he said. The door closed. At first, the heat was pleasant, the gentle initial warmth, the kind that loosens muscles and slows breathing to a different, more deliberate rhythm. Mara sat on the wooden bench and closed her eyes and thought about the baby. Thought about the ultrasound scheduled for next week. Thought about the name argument she and Daniel had been having by text for 2 days. He wanted Lena. She wanted something that started with an M, and neither of them was conceding anything. She did not notice the exact moment the quality of the heat changed. It happened gradually in the way that the body understands before the mind does. The sweat came differently, not the slow, surrendering perspiration of relaxation, but something faster, more urgent. The body beginning to use every system it had to manage, something it had not been designed to manage. Her heart rate climbed, then climbed again. She opened her eyes and looked at the temperature gauge mounted on the wall. The number it displayed was not the number of a therapeutic session. 98 degrees Celsius, not a low heat, not 15 minutes of gentle warmth arranged by a considerate mother-in-law. The temperature inside a room that a 26-week pregnant woman had been locked into by the man she trusted. Mara stood up. Standing at 26 weeks in a room approaching 100 degrees was something the body did not accomplish gracefully. She put one hand against the wall and found her balance, and crossed the small space to the door and pushed the handle. The door did not move. She pushed again, then tried the handle with both hands, then put her shoulder against it and used her weight, which was a different quantity than it had been 6 months ago, and the door was entirely and completely unresponsive in the way of something that has been secured from the outside. Cole, she kept her voice as level as she could, the reflex of a woman who had spent her life not sounding as frightened as she was. Cole, the door won't open. No response. She knocked, then knocked harder, open palm flat against the wood, in a way that cost energy she was increasingly aware she did not have to spare. She called his name again, then called out for anyone. She tried the handle 4 more times with the methodical persistence of a person who understands that panic is the least useful available option. The heat did not decrease. Her legs were wrong underneath her, not fully wrong. Not yet, but communicating something urgent and specific that she recognized as a warning she did not have the luxury of ignoring. She sat down on the floor near the door with her back against the wall and her hands on her belly and worked on breathing, even breaths, slower than her body wanted, giving the baby everything the body had left to give after managing its own distress. She knocked against the door with regular intervals, like a signal, not panicked, patient in the way of someone who has decided that patience is the only remaining option. She thought. Daniel was coming today, she thought. He said 4 o'clock. She thought, hold on. Daniel arrived at the estate at 12 minutes past 4. He was 31 and had spent the last 4 years in internal medicine at a hospital that handled more than its share of emergency cases. And the training had given him something that other people sometimes mistook for coldness, but was actually precision, the ability to see a situation clearly while still being fully inside it, to not let the emotional register of a thing prevent him from doing the necessary work of assessing it. He noticed immediately that Mara was not visible. This was not unusual in itself. She might be upstairs, or in the library, or napping in the way that pregnancy had begun to require. But something else registered beneath the concrete explanation and absence with a quality to it. The specific texture of a house where the person you are looking for is not just elsewhere, but unreachable. Miss Mara is in the sauna, the housekeeper said when he asked. She's been in there for about 20 minutes, I think. 20 minutes, 26 weeks. Daniel did not run to the basement staircase. He walked at the pace of a man who has already assessed the situation and knows that alarming the people around him will cost more time than it saves. But he walked quickly, and when they reached the corridor, and he heard or thought he heard a faint, rhythmic sound from behind the door at the end of it, he was already reaching for the handle, locked from the outside. The mechanism was a simple external bolt, the kind of thing used on storage rooms and equipment closets, not the kind of thing that had any business being engaged on a room that contained a person. Daniel turned to the housekeeper. Call 911 now. Flat, quiet, carrying the authority of a man who does not repeat instructions. Right now. Please, while she fumbled with her phone. He turned his attention to the door. He tried it once more, fully locked. No give, then stepped back and assessed the frame. Old construction, solid but not reinforced. He put his shoulder into it. First attempt. The frame shuddered. Second, a sound from the mechanism. Third, the door came open, and the heat poured out of it like a physical thing, like a wall being removed, and Daniel stepped through it into the room. Mara was on the floor near the door, the posture of someone who had tried to stay upright and lost the argument with gravity partway through. Her hair and clothes were soaked. Her breathing was shallow, rapid, wrong in the specific way that told him the body had been redirecting resources for a while now. Her eyes were closed. Daniel knelt beside her. He did everything he had been trained to do, in the order he had been trained to do it, with the hands of a man who has been in difficult rooms and knows how to be in them. He checked her pulse fast, weaker than it should be. He assessed her airway, her responsiveness, her color. He began the process of cooling her core temperature with what he had available. Mara, he said her name steadily, consistently. The way you call someone back from a distance. Mara, it's Daniel. Can you hear me? She did not respond. From the corridor above them, the first thread of a siren. Cole Whitfield appeared in the corridor when the paramedics were already inside. Daniel was standing at the door of the sauna room and watched him come down the corridor. White shirt, tie loosened, phone in hand in the manner of someone who had recently concluded a call. His face had the correct expression: alarm, concern, the brow drawn in a way that communicated urgency. He moved toward the gurney with the body language of a husband rushing to his wife. Daniel watched him the way he had learned to watch people. Cole was not panicking. There was a distinction important, diagnostic between a man performing distress and a man in distress. Panic does a specific thing to the body that cannot be entirely managed through performance. Not in the first 30 seconds. The hands behave differently. The voice loses a register or gains one. The eyes seek information, the particular ways of someone trying to understand something they don't yet know. Cole's eyes were not seeking information. They were monitoring. His phone had no signal, Daniel said. The sentence was neutral on its surface. I was in the study, Cole said, not looking at him directly. Signal drops in there sometimes. I didn't hear anything. Daniel noted this. And he noted one more thing. In the controlled chaos of the paramedics moving through the corridor, the housekeeper had said something to him. People said more than they intended when they were frightened, that had fallen into his memory with a weight he was still measuring. Mrs. Eleanor had called about 20 minutes ago for Cole, 3 minutes before Daniel had broken down the door. Eleanor Whitfield had called her son 3 minutes before the crisis became visible. Daniel stood in the corridor while the gurney moved past him, and he put that fact alongside the locked door and the temperature gauge reading, and Cole's monitoring eyes. And the shape they made together was not the shape of an accident. He said nothing. Not yet. Mara needed to be in the ambulance. And then she needed to be in the hospital. And then she needed to know her child was safe. Everything else could wait until she had those things. But he was already beginning to ask the questions he should have asked months ago. In the ambulance, Mara regained consciousness by degrees. The first thing she was aware of was the beeping steady, mechanical, the sound of a machine faithfully recording a heartbeat. Then the light, too bright and too even. Then Daniel's voice, close and calm, saying her name. Then, underneath everything else, the sound that undid her, her baby's heartbeat on the monitor, steady, regular, present in the way that only a creature who knows nothing about the world outside its own boundaries can be, without fear, without hesitation, without any awareness of how close the margin had been. Mara lay still and let the tears run sideways across her face into her hair and did not try to stop them. Not from pain, not from fear. Exactly. From the specific relief of that sound, its indifference to everything that had happened. Its simple insistence on continuing. "I'm okay," she said. Her voice was rough, dry, barely there. "You're going to be okay," Daniel corrected. He did not say what she had said. He did not offer the easier version. He never had. "So is the baby. We're going to run a full panel when we get there." She nodded. She looked at the ceiling of the ambulance and thought about the door. She thought about the temperature gauge. She thought about Cole appearing in the corridor with the correct face and the monitoring eyes and the phone he had been holding. She had spent years finding the generous explanation. She was extraordinarily good at it. She had refined it into a skill. Almost an art formed the ability to look at a thing that troubled her and locate the version of it that didn't require her to do anything difficult. She tried to find that version now. She looked for it honestly, in the specific way that you look for a thing. When you need to know whether it's there, it was not there. At 8 o'clock that evening, in a hospital room with fluorescent lighting, Cole sat beside Mara's bed and held her hand and said the right things in the right order. He was sorry. He hadn't known the door mechanism had an issue. He was going to have it looked at. The important thing was that she and the baby were safe. He was there. He wasn't going anywhere. Mara let him hold her hand. She did not push him away. Daniel stood near the window with his arms folded and said nothing during any of this. He watched. He recorded. One of the night nurses paused in the doorway to ask if Mrs. Whitfield needed anything, and said it in the tone of a person confirming what they already knew, that Mrs. Eleanor had already been in contact, and everything had been arranged. When did she call? Daniel had asked the nurse. Without looking up from Mara's chart, the nurse checked her notes. Maybe 7:40, around there, before the ambulance arrived. We had the notification from the paramedics at 8:06. She was very specific about which ward Mara should be placed in, and the names of the doctors she wanted involved. 30 minutes before the ambulance, the timeline assembled itself with the precision of a thing that had always been a timeline, waiting for someone to read it in order. Eleanor had called Cole 3 minutes before Daniel found the door. Eleanor had called the hospital before the ambulance arrived. Eleanor Whitfield had known, not guessed, not worried, known. Daniel stood at the window and looked at the city spread below him and allowed himself, for the first time since he had knelt on the sauna floor, to feel the full weight of what he believed had happened tonight. He felt it completely and did not look away from it, because looking away was the thing that had allowed it to happen in the first place. Tomorrow he would begin. He would pull every thread available to him. He would ask the questions that nobody in this family, including, sometimes, himself, had thought to ask. He would follow whatever those questions led to, wherever that was, however long it took, regardless of what it cost. Mara was his sister. The child she was carrying was his family. And someone in this house had just made a decision that could have taken both of them. Daniel was a doctor. He understood, better than most, the particular mathematics of how close nearly always still is from gone. He was not going to let it be close again. The hospital room had the quality of all hospital rooms, a studied neutrality, as if the space had been deliberately drained of anything that might provoke feeling, so that the feelings already present in the people inside it would have nowhere to deflect. Mara had been in rooms like this before. Her mother's appendix, when Mara was 17, Daniel's hand. The summer he was 22 and put it through a glass door during an argument with a wall he disagreed with. Those rooms had felt temporary incidents inside an otherwise continuing story. You passed through them on the way back to the life. This room felt different, not like a passage, like a turning point. She was sitting up in bed at 7 in the morning, the blanket pulled to her waist, her hands curled around a cup of decaffeinated tea she did not particularly want, when Daniel came back from wherever he had gone at 6 and placed a paper bag from the cafe downstairs on the table beside her. "Eggs," he said. "Whole grain. Don't tell me you're not hungry." "I wasn't going to," she said. He sat down in the chair he had occupied, intermittently, for the past 12 hours. He had slept in it for perhaps 3 of those, which she knew because she had watched him do it, the light sleep of someone whose body was resting while the mind kept working. She knew that sleep. She had learned it from their mother. "How do you feel?" he asked. "Better than last night," she said. She meant it. "Better than last night is not the target," he said. "I know, but it's where I am." He looked at her for a moment with the particular expression he reserved for when he was holding something back, not the suppression of anger, which was one kind of held-back thing, but the suppression of information, which was another. Mara had been reading that expression since they were children. It meant he knew something he had decided not to say yet. She did not ask. She was getting better at asking, but not this morning. Cole arrived at 8:15 with flowers, white peonies, not from a hospital gift shop, from a florist, carefully arranged, wrapped in the specific paper of a specific shop on the Upper East Side that Mara recognized because he had sent them before. He knew she liked peonies. He had always known things like that. He was very good at knowing the things that looked like love. He asked the nurse about her condition before he asked Mara directly, which was the considerate thing to do, the considerate order. Then he came in and set the flowers on the window ledge and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at her with the face of a man who had not slept. She did not know yet whether that was because he had been worried or because he had been working through something else entirely. "I'm okay," she said. She was watching him. "You terrified me," he said. He reached for her hand, and she let him take it. His hands were warm. They had always been warm. She thought about how many times she had registered that specific fact about him, the warmth of his hands as evidence of something, as if warmth were a quality that traveled uniformly from the hands to the person. "The door," she said. He nodded, immediately, as if he had already decided how to address this. "I called the facilities manager last night. He says the external bolt on that room was an old piece of hardware from the original construction. They've been meaning to remove it for years. It must have engaged somehow. It can't happen again. He's replacing the whole mechanism today." Mara looked at him, in the chair by the window. Daniel was looking at his phone, or appearing to look at his phone. She knew the difference. "It engaged somehow," she said. "It's old hardware," Cole said. "These things happen in old houses. The important thing is that Daniel was there. The important thing is that you're both okay." She said nothing. He filled the silence the way he always filled silences, with more words, more warmth, more of the texture of sincerity that she had spent 3 years reading as genuine. "I should have checked the room myself before you went in. I should have tested the door. That's on me. I'm sorry." An apology for not testing the door. Not for the door being locked. Not for the bolt that required a hand to engage it. An apology for a failure of precaution, which was a different thing, architecturally, than an apology for what had actually happened. Mara registered this. She registered it and placed it alongside the temperature gauge and the timeline and the warmth of his hands. And she felt, for the first time in 3 years of marriage, that she was looking at her husband without the lens she had always placed between herself and whatever she was seeing. The view without the lens was different. She did not show him this. She smiled, very slightly, and said, "Thank you for the flowers," and let him keep holding her hand, and looked at the peonies in their careful wrapping on the window ledge, and thought, "I need more information before I know what I am doing." Eleanor arrived at 10. She came the way Eleanor always came without announcing herself, as if the protocols that governed other people's arrivals did not apply to her, because they never had. She was 63, silver-haired in the way that made certain women look permanent rather than old, and she was wearing a dark coat and no jewelry, which Mara recognized as the specific Eleanor Whitfield aesthetic of a woman who does not need adornment to communicate authority. She stood in the doorway for a moment before she entered, just long enough. "My darling." She crossed the room and took Mara's free hand between both of hers. Cole had released it when his mother entered, which was also something Mara registered, and looked at her with the expression of a woman in genuine distress. It was flawless. The brow, the slight compression of the mouth, the eyes that communicated both relief and residual fear. "I keep thinking about what might have happened. That door, the facilities manager is handling it," Cole told me. "It should have been addressed years ago. I'm furious with myself for not catching it." The specific shape of this was impressive. Not furious with whoever locked the door. Not furious with the circumstance. Furious with herself for not catching a maintenance issue. It was the remorse of a woman taking responsibility for an oversight, not for an action. Mara watched Eleanor's face while Eleanor spoke, and she thought, "You are very good at this. You have been doing this for a very long time. You are good at it in a way that requires practice, and practice requires motivation. And I would like to understand what your motivation is." She did not say any of this. She said, "It's so kind of you to come." Daniel left the room at 10:30 on the pretext of getting coffee. He walked past the coffee machine without stopping and went directly to the nurse's station on the east end of the floor. He waited for a moment, in which the nurse he wanted, a woman in her 40s named Sarah, who had been on duty when Mara came in, was available. "I have a question about last night," he said, keeping his voice entirely neutral, conversational. "When Mrs. Whitfield, Eleanor Whitfield, called about my sister's condition last night, what time was that? Do you know?" A small hesitation. "She called the desk directly. I was on when the call came through," the nurse said. "Maybe 7:40, around there, before the ambulance arrived." Daniel said, "Yes, a bit before. We had the notification from the paramedics at 8:06. Daniel nodded. Eleanor had called the hospital at 7:40. The ambulance had arrived at 8:06. In between those two timestamps, 26 minutes, during which the hospital had not yet been notified of an incoming patient. But Eleanor Whitfield had already made contact to inquire about her daughter-in-law's condition. He kept his face entirely still. "She must have been very worried." "She seemed, yes," the nurse said, choosing her word carefully. "She was very specific about which ward Mara should be placed in if she was admitted, and the names of the doctors she wanted involved. Very specific, Daniel said. Very prepared, the nurse said, and then seemed to realize she had offered a characterization rather than a fact, and returned to the neutral language of her profession. Daniel thanked her. He walked back toward Mara's room at the pace of a man who is thinking something through completely before he acts on any part of it. Very prepared. At noon, Mara told Cole she wanted to go to Daniel's apartment for the remainder of the week. She did not offer an extended explanation. She said she would be more comfortable somewhere familiar, that she and Daniel had already discussed it, that it was a practical arrangement, given that he could monitor her recovery more easily. All of this was true. It was also not the whole truth. Cole agreed immediately. Of course, whatever you need. Eleanor, who was still in the room, did not agree immediately. The pause lasted perhaps 2 seconds. For a woman of Eleanor's composure, 2 seconds was a long time to pause. I think the estate makes more practical sense, Eleanor said. Her voice was precisely calibrated, gentle but clear. The tone of a woman offering a considered alternative rather than an objection. The medical suite is set up. Dr. Harmon can manage her recovery plan. And it's important, after something like this, to have consistent care. You should have your family around you. Daniel is her family, Cole said. Another pause, shorter this time. Of course, Eleanor said, smoothing something on her sleeve that did not need smoothing. I only meant the estate has more support in place, more staff. I would feel better knowing she had that around her. Mara looked at Eleanor. This was the thing about Eleanor that she had been telling herself for months, was protectiveness, maternal instinct extended, generously, to the woman carrying her grandchild, the way Eleanor always suggested, always recommended, always arranged. Always knew Beast Mara had been reading that as care, intensive, perhaps overbearing, but genuinely motivated by care. The woman who had called the hospital before the ambulance arrived had been very prepared. I'll be more comfortable at Daniel's, Mara said. Thank you, Eleanor. Something happened in Eleanor's face. Not a crack, Eleanor did not crack, but a compression. An internal adjustment. The expression of a woman who has encountered a variable behaving unexpectedly and is calculating in real time what that means. Of course, she said and smiled, and said nothing more about it. Cole was helping organize Mara's discharge paperwork in the corridor when she reached for his jacket, which was folded over the back of the chair. She was not looking for anything specific. She was not executing a plan. This was a woman reaching for her husband's jacket because her hand cream was in it, and he had gone to find it from a bag. His wallet fell open when she picked the jacket up. Inside the wallet, behind his work ID and his credit cards, was a folded piece of paper. She would not have looked at it. She would have put the wallet back. But the paper was folded with one edge visible, and on that edge, in Cole's handwriting, was a name she did not recognize. She hesitated for exactly 1 second. Then she unfolded it. A name, Dr. Peter Voss, and a phone number with a Westport area code. Below the number, 2 words in Cole's handwriting. Second opinion. She refolded the paper. She replaced the wallet. She straightened the jacket and laid it back over the chair and was looking at her phone when Cole came back into the room. Found it, he said, and smiled. Thank you, she said, and smiled back. She thought. Dr. Peter Voss, Westport, second opinion. She thought. I am going to need to understand what that means. They arrived at Daniel's apartment at 4 in the afternoon. It was a third-floor walk-up on the Upper West Side that he had occupied for 6 years and showed no signs of updating books on every surface. A kitchen that functioned primarily as a place to make coffee. A spare room he used as a study that he had converted into a space that contained a bed and a reading lamp and a table beside it and almost nothing else. Exactly what was needed and nothing superfluous. Mara had always loved it here. She changed into clothes that were not hospital clothes and sat on the couch that faced the window and watched the street below while Daniel made tea in the kitchen. He came and sat across from her. They looked at each other. This was something they had been doing since childhood, the specific look that meant, I know you know, and you know I know, and we can either say it or let it be said by the look itself. Tell me, Mara said. Daniel set down his tea. What do you want to start with? He asked. The door, she said. Tell me what you actually think about the door. External bolt, he said. Old hardware, like Cole said. Those bolts require manual engagement. They don't engage by accident. Someone slides them closed deliberately. You think Cole did it. I think someone did it. And I think Cole was the last person with access to that door before you went in. Mara was quiet for a moment. Eleanor called the hospital before the ambulance got there, she said. Daniel's eyes sharpened. You knew. The night nurse mentioned it in a passing way. I think she thought I already knew. 20 minutes before. Daniel, she called 20 minutes before. 26, he said. I checked. They sat with that. 26 minutes. The margin between knowing and not knowing. Why? Mara said. The word came out very flat, not rhetorical. She was genuinely asking, because she had not yet been able to construct an answer that held together. I'm carrying her grandchild. What possible? I don't know, Daniel said. Yet. The word yet was important. It was the word that separated what he was doing from what they didn't know. He was not telling her he had answers. He was telling her the answers were the next step. There's something else, Mara said. She looked at him steadily. In Cole's wallet, a name Peter Voss, Westport area code. His note said second opinion. Daniel's expression shifted. Do you know who that is? No, I'll find out. She nodded. After a while she said, I've been explaining everything. I know. Every time something felt wrong, I found a reason it wasn't wrong. The way he made decisions without asking me. The way Eleanor always arranged things before I was consulted. The way our lives at the estate looked exactly like what I had imagined wanting and felt completely different from the inside. She set the tea down. I told myself I was being ungrateful. I told myself this was what it looked like to be taken care of. Mara, let me finish. She wasn't angry. Her voice was the particular flatness of someone in the process of saying a true thing for the first time. I did that because it was easier than the alternative. And the alternative was what? That the man I married doesn't love me the way I thought he did. That the family I married into isn't what I thought it was. She shook her head slowly. I have been looking at this marriage through a filter I chose because the raw version was too frightening. Daniel said nothing. There was nothing useful to say to that. Help me see it clearly, she said. That's what I'm doing, he said. 3 blocks away. Cole Whitfield sat in the car he had parked outside Daniel's building for 20 minutes before realizing he was not going to go in. He had wanted to. He had followed them at a distance, not because he had decided to follow them, but because he had not been able to stop himself. And that distinction between intention and compulsion was one he had been examining uncomfortably for the past several hours. His phone rang. His mother. He looked at the screen for a long moment. The name there, Eleanor, that he had looked at his entire life with the simple certainty of someone whose entire world had been organized around that name, that person, that instruction. He thought about Mara in the hospital bed with the flowers he had brought on the window ledge and the look on her face when she had said it engaged somehow back to him. He thought about what he had done and what he had told himself about why he had done it, and the gap between those two things. He thought about his mother calling 3 minutes before Daniel broke down the door. He had known, not consciously, not in the language of explicit understanding, but somewhere below language, in the place where the body keeps what the mind refuses to hold. He had known that the door had not engaged by accident, and that he had stood outside it, and that his mother had called him 3 minutes before Daniel's shoulder met the wood. He had known, and he had chosen not to know. And Mara had been on the floor of that room while he chose. He pressed decline on the call. The phone immediately showed Eleanor calling again. He pressed decline again. He sat in the car for another 10 minutes, not going anywhere, not calling anyone, just sitting with the weight of 2 canceled calls and what they meant. Then he drove to the city apartment, their apartment, the one they had shared before Eleanor had offered them something bigger. He let himself in. He stood in the living room in the dark and did not turn on the lights, and thought about the woman he had married, and the family he had grown up in, and the specific place where those two things had, without his full awareness, become incompatible. He did not sleep that night. Daniel had a habit, developed over years of working in a hospital, where the paperwork was as consequential as the medicine, of being precise about documentation, not meticulous in the anxious way of someone afraid of mistakes, precise in the way of someone who understood that the record of a thing was sometimes the only thing that outlasted the thing itself. He filed his notes the same day. He cross-referenced. He followed chains of information to their ends rather than stopping at the point where the necessary work was complete, because he had learned early that the necessary work and the complete work were not always the same work. It was this habit, not intuition, not luck, not any of the things people would later call it, that led him to what he found on the morning of the 3rd day after the sauna. Mara was still asleep when he sat down at his desk at 6:15. He was doing her insurance paperwork. This was the kind of task that accumulated around a hospitalization, like sediment forms that needed cross-referencing, numbers that needed verifying, dates that needed to match across 3 different documents. He found it almost meditative, the small logic of administrative detail, the way everything was supposed to fit together and occasionally didn't, and the fit told you something. He was accessing the hospital's patient records system. He had privileges at several affiliated institutions through a research collaboration to verify a procedure code for the monitoring equipment used overnight when he encountered something he had not been looking for. A flagged record in Mara's file from 8 years ago. She had been treated at this hospital at 20 years old. A minor procedure, fully resolved. Nothing relevant to the current situation. He clicked into the record to confirm the insurance history and found, attached to it, a secondary document that should not have been in an insurance file. A lab result from 8 years ago ordered by a Dr. R. Caldwell, whose affiliation was listed as Whitfield Family Medical Practice. He read it once. Then he read it again, very slowly. It was a paternity confirmation test. Standard format. 2 samples submitted, one labeled MH and one labeled RW. The result column contained a single percentage, 99.97% probability of biological paternity. The reference number at the top of the document connected to a patient file. The patient file belonged to Robert Whitfield, founder of Whitfield Holdings, father of Cole Whitfield, dead for 6 years, of a cardiac event at 61. Robert Whitfield, who had apparently, 20 years before his death, fathered a child with a woman named Helen Huang, who was Mara and Daniel's mother. Daniel sat at his desk for a while. He was a man who dealt in facts, and the fact in front of him was a clear one. His sister had married Cole Whitfield without knowing that Cole was the son of her biological father. Robert Whitfield had 2 children, apparently, one born in legitimate marriage to Eleanor, raised and groomed and positioned as the heir to everything his father built, and one born to a woman named Helen Huang, who had raised 2 children alone in a small apartment and worked 2 jobs and never, as far as Daniel knew, spoken a word about the man who had left when Mara was 4. Not left because he was that kind of man, apparently. Left because he had been asked to leave by the kind of people who arrange things. Daniel was a physician. He had delivered difficult news to people in rooms like this one. He had learned that the delivery of a truth is a kind of medical act. It has a timing, a context, a preparation that determines whether the person receiving it is able to hold it without being destroyed by it. He was not going to tell Mara today. He was going to make a phone call first. Thomas Reed was a 44-year-old attorney who specialized in estate and inheritance law, had handled 3 cases involving contested biological paternity in the context of corporate succession, and had been referred to Daniel by a colleague at the hospital who described him as the kind of lawyer who reads every document twice and asks the question nobody else thought to ask. Daniel called him at 7:15. He explained the situation in the precise language of someone relaying facts rather than feelings. The test result, the date, the identities involved, the current marital situation of his sister, the prenuptial agreement that Eleanor Whitfield had insisted upon before the wedding, which Mara had signed without having it reviewed by independent counsel because Cole had said it was standard. Reed listened without interrupting. When Daniel finished, there was a pause. "She doesn't know," Reed said. It was not a question. "No, and the marriage is currently intact, for the moment." Another pause. "The prenuptial agreement, do you have a copy?" "I can get one." "Get one, and I need to review the Whitfield Holdings corporate charter and any succession provisions attached to Robert Whitfield's estate. If there is a biological heir of Robert Whitfield's legitimate or not, and the corporate charter contains provisions for biological succession." He stopped. "This is potentially a very different conversation than the one you called me about." "I know," Daniel said. "Your sister being married to the son of the man whose estate she may have a claim to, that is either the most extraordinary coincidence I have encountered in 20 years of practice," Reed said, "or it is not a coincidence." "It is not a coincidence," Daniel said. He hung up the phone and sat for a while in the early morning quiet of his apartment. He thought about Eleanor Whitfield, who had arranged the prenuptial agreement and arranged the estate move and arranged the doctor and called the hospital before the ambulance arrived, and had looked at Mara in the hospital bed with the flawless expression of a concerned mother-in-law. He thought about a woman who had known, before the wedding, who Mara was, who had arranged the marriage not in spite of that knowledge, but because of it, who had spent 3 years positioning her son's wife in a location she could observe and manage and, when necessary, intervene with. He thought about a woman who needed the child Mara was carrying not to be born, not because she disliked Mara, not because she bore any personal animosity toward the baby, because the baby, once born, might trigger a DNA test. And a DNA test might confirm what Eleanor already knew. And what Eleanor already knew was the one thing that could dismantle everything she had spent 30 years building and protecting. The child was evidence. The child was a living, biological record of the thing Eleanor needed to remain buried. Daniel sat with that until he heard Mara moving in the spare room. And then he went to the kitchen and made breakfast, and was entirely ordinary about it, because she needed to eat and rest and not carry this yet. Cole drove to his mother's house on a Tuesday morning without telling her he was coming. The Connecticut estate with its stone walls and oak-lined drive had functioned, for as long as he could remember, as the fixed point around which everything else orbited his career, his decisions, his sense of what the world was and how it functioned. When things were uncertain, he came here. When things were clear, he came here to report. Today he was coming for neither of those reasons. Eleanor was in the East Garden when he arrived. She was doing something with the roses. She always had something to do with the roses, as if tending them were the one task she performed without any secondary agenda. She looked up when she heard him on the gravel and did not seem surprised. Eleanor never seemed surprised. He had spent 40 years trying to determine whether this was because she was always prepared or because she was always watching, and he had never settled the question. Cole. She straightened and removed her gardening gloves with the unhurried manner of a woman for whom everything operates at her pace. "I wasn't expecting you." "I know," he said. He stopped a few feet from her. She looked at him for a moment. Then she turned and walked toward the garden bench along the south wall. She sat, she waited. He stayed standing. He had driven 90 minutes with the specific intention of asking a question that he had not fully formulated yet. Because the question that was forming in him was not the kind of question a person asked their mother. It was the kind of question that, once asked, reorganized the entire structure of what a person was to another person. He asked it anyway. "Did you know who Mara was before I met her?" The garden was very quiet. A bird somewhere in the hedges. The sound of a car, distant on the road beyond the walls. Eleanor looked at a point in the middle distance, not avoiding his gaze exactly, but choosing a different focal point, the way a person does when they are deciding how much to say. "That's a complicated question," she said. "It's a direct question. Most direct questions about complicated things are also complicated questions," Eleanor said. "The DNA test," Cole said. "From 8 years ago, in her hospital file, something shifted, very small. The quality of her stillness changed in the specific way that happened when Eleanor encountered information she had not authorized to be in circulation." "Where did you see that?" Daniel is a physician. He had access to her hospital records for the insurance paperwork. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. She looked at her gardening gloves, folded in her lap. "Your father," she said finally. was not a faithful man. You know that. I have never pretended otherwise. She's his daughter. She was the result of a relationship he maintained for several years with a woman named Helen Huang. I became aware of it in the final year of his life. Your father wished to acknowledge the child, to amend his estate provisions. He died before he was able to do so. Before he was able to, Cole repeated. Before anyone allowed him to, Cole said. She held his gaze. The corporate succession provisions in your father's charter are specific about biological heirs. A confirmed biological child, regardless of the circumstances of their birth, has a standing claim to a portion of the estate, 40%. According to the language Robert insisted on, if Mara were confirmed as his biological daughter, she would be entitled to 40% of the Whitfield Holdings structure, not as your wife, as his child. That stake would supersede the marital agreement entirely. So you arranged the marriage. I managed the situation. You arranged for me to meet a woman you already knew was my father's daughter, and you did not tell me, Cole said. His voice was still level. You put us in a marriage together without telling either of us who she was. Eleanor met his eyes. What Mara doesn't know cannot be used as a legal instrument. The garden was quiet again. Cole thought about Mara in the hospital bed, the peonies on the window ledge. The way she had said it engaged somehow back to him with the voice of someone choosing, carefully, how much to reveal. He thought about the door. He thought about what he had done. He thought about a baby he had not yet met but who existed, indisputably, as the most real thing in a situation that had otherwise revealed itself to be almost entirely constructed. We're going to end the pregnancy, Eleanor said. Her voice was very quiet. Not a request. There are ways to manage these situations that do not require no, Cole said. The word came out before he had decided to say it, but it came out solid, which surprised him, because he had spent 40 years expecting his own resistance to feel tentative. Eleanor looked at him. What did you say? No, he said. We are not going to do that. Cole, you need to think about what you are protecting. If that child is born and a DNA test is ordered, then it's ordered, he said. He heard something in his own voice that he didn't recognize. Not anger. Something underneath anger. Older, quieter, and more durable. We are not going to do anything to Mara or to that baby. I will not do it. Eleanor looked at him for a long time. You do what I tell you, she said, very quietly, or you are no longer my son. Cole said nothing. He turned and walked back across the gravel to his car, and he heard his mother call his name once as he reached the gate, and he did not stop. He had not complied. That was the true thing, and it was a first. But he had not yet been brave enough to act. That was also true. And it sat in him alongside the first truth like a second weight he did not yet know how to put down. Mara had been thinking about Eleanor since the hospital. She thought about the first time she had met Eleanor, the dinner Cole had arranged at the estate, 6 weeks into their relationship. The way Eleanor had looked at her, not with a reserved assessment of a woman meeting her son's new girlfriend, but with something more complex, a kind of recognition. Mara had thought at the time. She had assumed it was recognition of a type, the type of woman Eleanor could place within her social taxonomy. She understood now that she had been right about the recognition and wrong about its source. She thought about the prenuptial agreement. Eleanor had suggested it, had recommended a specific attorney, her attorney, who had drafted the document. Cole had said it was standard. Mara had signed it. She had not had it reviewed because she had been in the generous interpretation phase of her engagement, and reviewing your prenuptial agreement with independent counsel felt like a declaration of distrust. She thought about Eleanor's questions about the pregnancy. Eleanor asked about the due date with a frequency that she had been reading as grandmotherly excitement. Every time they spoke, the question circled back. When is the due date? How is the doctor's timeline looking? Have they revised the expected date? Not how are you feeling? Not how is the baby? When is the due date? The due date mattered if you were timing something. The due date mattered if you were working against a specific calendar. The due date mattered to a woman who needed something to happen before another thing happened. Mara placed the book face down on the bed. She got up from the bed and went to find her brother. He was at his desk. He looked up when she appeared in the doorway, and she saw the calculation in his face, the assessment of whether she was ready, and the conclusion that she was. "Sit down," he said. She sat. He did not tell her about the DNA test immediately. He told her about Thomas Reed first, who he was, why Daniel had called him, what Reed had said about the prenuptial agreement and the corporate charter. He built the context before he placed the thing at the center of it, because he was a doctor and he understood preparation. When he told her about the test result, she was very quiet for a long time. She did not cry. She sat with her hands in her lap and looked at a point past his shoulder and processed it in the particular way she processed things systematically, looking at each implication before moving to the next, not allowing the emotional register to outpace the intellectual one until she had the full shape of what she was dealing with. Then she said, very steadily, "She arranged the marriage." "Yes," Daniel said. "She knew who I was. She arranged for Cole to meet me. She brought me into the family where she could keep me close enough to watch. She needed to know if I knew, and I didn't know. So she kept me there and managed everything. And when I got pregnant, she stopped. She needed the baby not to be born," Daniel said, before anyone could order a test. Mara put her hand on her belly. The motion was unconscious, the reflex of a woman who had spent months making that gesture. "My father," she said, not a question, a statement that needed to be said aloud to determine whether it would hold. "Robert Whitfield," Daniel said. "Yes, I married his son. She arranged it," Daniel said. "Neither of you knew." Mara was quiet again. "The prenuptial agreement," she said, "the one Eleanor's lawyer drafted. Reed is reading it now. She drafted it. She wrote the terms. She determined the language." She looked at Daniel with an expression he had never seen on her before, not anger, not grief, but the very focused clarity of someone assembling an idea. Why would a woman like Eleanor write a prenuptial agreement that didn't completely protect her own family's interests, unless she was very certain she already knew what was in it? And she didn't consider the possibility that the terms could be read differently by someone with different information than she had. She had spent 3 years not seeing what was in front of her. She saw it now with the particular crystalline precision of someone who has removed a filter they didn't know they were wearing. "Get me the prenuptial agreement," she said. "Tonight. Mara, tonight." "Daniel, I want to read every word." The prenuptial agreement was 41 pages long. Mara read it at Daniel's kitchen table, beginning at 9 o'clock in the evening and ending at 12:40 in the morning. She read it the way she had been trained to read dense, technical documentation, not skimming, not looking for the obvious, but moving through it at the pace of someone who understands that the consequential thing is rarely in the place that announces itself. She made notes in the margins of the printed copy Daniel had retrieved from Thomas Reed, who had sent it by encrypted file transfer with his own annotations in red. Reed's annotations were careful and measured, the markings of a man who had read many documents designed to obscure their own meaning and had learned to be patient with them. But there was one section where his annotations stopped being measured and became, instead, very still, no words written. Just a bracket around a paragraph on page 31, and beside it a single notation in his handwriting. See this, Mara had seen it. She had read it 3 times before she moved on, and then she had continued to the end of the document. And then she had come back to page 31 and read it a 4th time. The clause was titled, Provision for Biological Succession Rights. In the formal architecture of a prenuptial agreement, it was positioned as a protective measure, a clause that ensured any biological Whitfield heir, in the event of a dissolution of marriage, retained their rights of succession and could not be excluded from estate or corporate entitlements through the marital agreement. Eleanor had written it to protect Cole. The language was unambiguous. Any biological descendant of Robert Allen Whitfield, whether born within or outside the bounds of the marital union described herein, retains irrevocable rights of claim to any estate provisions designated for biological heirs in Robert Allen Whitfield's estate charter, said rights to be verified through independent DNA confirmation upon request of any party to this agreement. Eleanor had written it to mean, regardless of what happens in this marriage, Cole cannot be cut out of his father's estate through a dissolution agreement she had not considered, could not have considered, because she was operating on the certainty that Mara would never know the truth, that the clause she wrote to protect her son as the instrument that confirmed her daughter-in-law's claim. Any biological descendant of Robert Allen Whitfield. Mara set the document down and looked at the kitchen wall for a while. She thought about the specific irony of a woman who had spent 30 years constructing protections against every contingency she could imagine, who had written language precise enough to withstand legal scrutiny, who had designed every element of a situation to guarantee a specific outcome, and who had missed the one variable that made all of it collapse. Not through carelessness, through certainty, through the kind of absolute confidence in her own knowledge of a situation that makes a person stop checking the edges. Eleanor had been certain Mara would never know. Eleanor had been wrong. She missed it, Mara said. Daniel looked up from his own copy across the table. It was past 1 in the morning, and they were on their 2nd pot of tea. The clause is bilateral, he said. She wrote it for Cole. But the language doesn't specify Cole. It specifies any biological descendant of Robert Whitfield. You qualify. I qualify, Mara said. I can use the clause she wrote to invoke my own rights, to invoke a request for independent DNA confirmation, which then, if confirmed, activates the succession provisions in your father's corporate charter, Daniel said, pausing on the last word. 40% of Whitfield holdings. Mara looked at the document. She was not thinking about 40% of Whitfield holdings. She was thinking about a woman named Helen Huang, who had worked 2 jobs and raised 2 children, and had never mentioned a name. She thought about her mother, who had been protecting her from something that was not simple. And whatever arrangement had been made, Whatever conversation had happened between Helen Huang and the people who managed situations for the Whitfield family, her mother had carried it alone for 28 years, without letting it touch her children. Mara thought about the kind of love that manifests as silence, about the cost of that silence, and who had actually paid it. "I need to call Mom," she said. "Tomorrow," Daniel said, not dismissively, gently, in the way of someone who understands the order things need to happen in. "Let her sleep tonight. This will still be true in the morning." Mara nodded. "I want to call an emergency board meeting," she said. Daniel looked at her. "The clause allows any party to this agreement to request DNA confirmation. Once I invoke it, the board is required, under the corporate charter, to convene a succession review within 72 hours. Reed confirmed this. Eleanor structured the charter herself the same way she structured the prenup. She wrote the rules for a game she was certain no one else was playing. "She will fight it," Daniel said. "The moment you invoke the clause, she will understand what you have. She will move against you." "She has already moved against me," Mara said. The evenness in her voice was not the evenness of suppression. It was the particular flatness that comes from the far side of shock, when the thing that should be devastating has already been looked at directly and survived. "She locked me in a room at 98 degrees Celsius when I was 26 weeks pregnant. Whatever she is willing to do next, she has already shown me what she is capable of. I would rather face it from a position of action than spend another day waiting for her next move." Daniel was quiet for a moment. "Reed says the board meeting can be called for Friday," he said. "That gives us 3 days to prepare." "Then we have 3 days." Cole arrived on a Thursday morning. He did not call first. Mara learned later that he had sat outside in his car for 20 minutes before coming up, which she understood as the behavior of someone who was not certain of his reception and was taking it seriously rather than assuming. She opened the door and looked at him. He was not what she expected. She had been preparing, over the past 72 hours, for a confrontation for the version of Cole who would arrive with a position already selected. The managed warmth and the correct words and the architecture of plausibility that she had spent 3 years accepting as sincerity. He was not that Cole. He was standing in the hallway with no jacket and no prepared expression, and he looked like a man who had not slept in 3 days, because he had not slept in 3 days. And he was holding a manila envelope. "I'm not asking you to let me in," he said. "I'm asking you to take this. You can close the door after." She took the envelope. She did not close the door. He stood in the hallway while she opened it. Inside, printed pages, email headers, internal correspondence from Whitfield Holdings addresses. She scanned the headers' dates, recipients, subject lines, and her eye caught a chain of 4 emails dated 6 weeks before the sauna. The sender address, Eleanor's private server. The subject line, Situation Management East Wing. Mara read the first email, then the second. The language was not explicit. Eleanor was too careful for explicit language in written communication, but it was specific enough. References to the medical timeline. References to necessary intervention before the procedural window closes. A reference to the East Wing facilitation and the notation that Dr. Voss has confirmed the parameters. Dr. Peter Voss, Westport, the name from Cole's wallet. Mara looked up. She arranged it, she said. Not a question, not accusation. Verification. "She told me it was management," Cole said. His voice was doing something difficult, staying level over something that did not want to be level. She told me it was a necessary step, that the heat would be low enough to cause complications without. He stopped. She told me the baby wouldn't. He stopped again. I believed what she told me because I have been believing what she tells me my entire life. And I did what she said because I have been doing what she says my entire life. And when Daniel broke down that door, I stood in that corridor and looked at my wife on the floor. And I understood something that I cannot ununderstand. Mara looked at him. I'm not asking for anything. He said, I am not here to be forgiven. I did not come here because I think this makes us even, or because I think giving you evidence against my mother earns me something back. I came because you needed this, and I had it, and I did not want to spend one more hour being the person who had something you needed, and chose not to give it to you. She looked at him for a long time. She thought about the version of herself that had opened his jacket and found a folded piece of paper and had refolded it and put it back. The version that had gone on being the wife in the correct arrangement because being in a correct arrangement was what she knew how to do. She thought about her child, hers. Whatever else was true, and about the particular accountability she felt toward that child that she had never felt toward anything else in quite the same way. Come in, she said. He came in. He sat at the kitchen table across from Daniel, who looked at him with the expression of a man who has reserved final judgment but has not issued any preliminary ones either. Cole looked back at Daniel with the expression of a man who considers that appropriate. Mara placed the emails on the table. There is going to be a board meeting tomorrow. I am going to invoke the succession clause in the prenuptial agreement and request independent DNA confirmation. When that confirmation comes back, I will have a claim to 40% of Whitfield Holdings. She looked at Cole. Your mother is going to know the moment I file the petition. She will move against you if she believes you helped me. I know I'm not asking you to testify. I'm not asking you to appear. The emails are enough. I'll testify, he said. If it comes to that. Mara looked at him carefully. She was looking for the calculation, for the angle, the version of this that served his interests. The strategic repositioning that would make this choice look like charity, but was actually self-preservation. She looked for it honestly and thoroughly. The way she had been teaching herself to look at things these past few days, she did not find it. What she found was a man who looked like someone in the process of becoming a different version of himself, and who was not certain the process would succeed, and who was doing it anyway. It was not enough to repair anything, but it was real. That at least was real. Thomas Reed arrived at 10 that morning with the petition, the prenuptial agreement with the relevant clause highlighted, and an affidavit from an independent DNA testing laboratory confirming their procedure and timeline confirmation could be completed within 48 hours of sample submission. He sat at the kitchen table and laid it out with the systematic clarity of a man who had reviewed it twice and had no outstanding questions. The petition invokes Article 14. Section 3 of the prenuptial agreement, the biological succession clause. It requests independent DNA confirmation and triggers the board's obligation to convene a succession review under Section 7 of the corporate charter. He looked at Mara. The moment you file this with the board secretary, the clock starts. Eleanor's team will see it within minutes. They will understand immediately what it means. Good, Mara said. she will contest it. She has 3 board members who have voted with her position for 15 years. She has attorneys who have been managing Whitfield Holdings' legal architecture for 30 years and know every procedural mechanism available. She will use all of it. I want to be certain you understand what you are walking into. I understand what I have been walking into for 3 years, Mara said. I would like to start walking into it on my own terms. Reed looked at her for a moment. Then he placed the petition on the table and uncapped his pen. "Sign here," he said. And here, she signed. At 4:15 in the afternoon, Mara took the elevator to the 43rd floor of the Whitfield Holdings Tower in Midtown. She had not been in this building before. She had come today for one reason: to see the building, to stand in it, and understand that she was standing in something that was partly hers, that had always been partly hers, that she had been maneuvered away from, and managed around, and nearly killed to keep her from. She stood in the lobby for a few minutes and looked at it. Then she took the elevator to the 43rd floor. The elevator doors opened. Her phone rang. She looked at the screen. Eleanor. She stood in the elevator with the doors open and looked at the name on the screen. She thought about a woman in a garden with gardening gloves folded in her lap, saying, "I managed a situation," with the voice of someone who had never been required to use any other language. She thought about a hospital desk call, placed 26 minutes before an ambulance arrived. She thought about page 31 of a 41-page document, and the bracket that Thomas Reed had drawn around a paragraph that its author had never imagined being used against her. She stepped out of the elevator. The phone rang again in her hand. Eleanor on the screen. The 3rd time in 2 minutes. She pressed the phone into her pocket and walked toward the boardroom at the end of the corridor. Behind her, the elevator doors closed. The phone went to voicemail. That night, Mara did not sleep for a long time. She lay in the spare room with her hand on her belly and listened to the building settle around her and thought about tomorrow. She was not afraid. That surprised her when she registered it. What was there instead was something different, quieter and more durable. The specific quality of a person who has stopped pretending and is therefore no longer spending energy on the pretense. At 11:15, Mara's phone buzzed once with a text from an unknown number. "The board members you need are Hartwell, Ossie, and Brennan. Hartwell has voted against Eleanor twice. In the last 4 years, he disagrees with her approach to risk. Ossie is independent and reads everything. Brennan follows whoever presents the clearest case. Present to those 3 first. The others will follow when the numbers confirm." She read it twice. Then she typed back, "Who is this?" The reply came after 30 seconds. "Someone who has worked in that building for 22 years and has been waiting for someone to walk into that room with this particular information." Another message. "My name is Carolyn Vance. I was your father's executive assistant for 11 years. He spoke of your mother. He regretted many things. I have been hoping someone would eventually come for this building. Go in through the east entrance tomorrow. The boardroom is staged for Eleanor's positioning. The east entrance gives you a different setup at the table. Hartwell always sits east." Mara lay in the dark for a long time after that. She thought about how many people had known things, how many people had been watching and waiting in the particular way of people without power who accumulate knowledge as the only available resource. She thought about the architecture of kept secrets how they were not really kept at all, but simply contained, held in place by the force of the people with the means to contain them, until someone came along with enough leverage to release the pressure. She was the leverage. She closed her eyes. Tomorrow. The east entrance to the Whitfield Holdings boardroom was a door that most people walked past. It was set slightly back from the main corridor, unmarked except for a small brass plate, and it opened onto the side of the room rather than the head of the table. Mara used it anyway. She arrived at 8:50 with Thomas Reed beside her and Daniel 2 steps back, which was where he had positioned himself without being asked, close enough to be present, far enough to make clear that she was the one walking in. Reed carried the briefcase. Daniel carried nothing. Mara carried the document folder herself. The boardroom was a long rectangle of dark wood and morning light. 9 chairs at the table, 4 already occupied. She scanned the room the way she had been trained to scan systems, looking for structure before content, understanding the layout before reading what it contained. Hartwell was at the east end of the table. 60s, silver at the temples, the contained expression of a man who had been in many rooms and had learned not to show his position until he had heard what he needed to hear. O.C. was beside him, younger, 40s, reading something on a tablet with the focus of someone genuinely reading rather than performing the appearance of it. Brennan was at the center, heavy-set, pen already in hand, which meant he took notes, which meant he was the kind of person who needed to process information through the writing of it. Eleanor arrived through the main entrance at the head of the table, accompanied by 2 attorneys and a woman who was carrying a second briefcase. Eleanor walked to the head of the table with the unhurried pace of a woman for whom this room has always functioned as an extension of her will. She saw Mara. The pause lasted perhaps 1 full second. Then Eleanor sat down and placed her hands flat on the wood and looked at her daughter-in-law with an expression that communicated, across the length of the room, that whatever Mara believed she was doing here, Eleanor had already considered it from every angle and found the response. "Mara," she said, the tone of a woman acknowledging an unexpected guest with impeccable manners. "I wasn't certain you'd come yourself. I thought it was important," Mara said, "to be in the room." The board secretary called the meeting to order at 9:15 and read the petition into the record. Invocation of Article 14. Section 3 of the prenuptial agreement of Mara Huang and Cole Whitfield, requesting independent DNA confirmation of biological descent from Robert Allen Whitfield and triggering succession review under Section 7 of the Whitfield Holdings Corporate Charter. The room was very quiet when she finished reading. Hartwell had put down the pen he'd been holding. O.C. had set aside the tablet. Brennan had begun writing something. Eleanor's lead attorney, a man named Garfield who had been practicing corporate law since before Mara was born, spoke first. The board should be aware that the petition, as filed, contains several procedural irregularities which render it contestable under. "The petition is properly filed," Reed said, not loudly, with the specific quietness of a man who does not need volume to be heard. Article 14. Section 3 requires only the signature of one party to the marital agreement and the submission of the request to the board secretary. Both conditions have been met. Clara Strand received the petition at 2:07 yesterday afternoon and confirmed receipt at 2:22. The procedural record is complete. Garfield looked at him with the expression of one attorney assessing another. The clause was drafted to protect the interests of any biological descendant of Robert Allen Whitfield, Reed said. The language is not ambiguous on this point. If the board would like, I can read the relevant section. We have it, Hartwell said. His voice was dry and measured. We've all read it. He looked at Eleanor. Mrs. Whitfield, I think it would be useful to understand your position on the substance of the petition, rather than its procedural standing. The petition is based on a laboratory document of uncertain provenance, Eleanor said, a result from 8 years ago, obtained under circumstances that were not disclosed to any member of this family, attached to a medical record that the DNA result was filed under my father's patient number, Mara said. The room shifted. She had planned to let Reed carry the early part. She had planned to speak when the moment called for it, not before. But something in the careful incompleteness of Eleanor's framing required correction before it could accumulate momentum. And she was done letting things accumulate. The result was ordered by Dr. R. Caldwell of the Whitfield Family Medical Practice, she continued. Filed under Robert Whitfield's patient number. The methodology was standard paternity confirmation. The result was 99.97% probability of biological paternity. She placed the document copy on the table and slid it toward the board secretary, who passed it to the board members. I am not claiming that result as definitive. I am requesting independent confirmation, which is precisely what the clause exists to provide. She looked at Eleanor. What I am asking for is a test. If I am wrong about what the test will show, I will be wrong publicly and completely, and the matter will be closed. What I would like to understand is why the response to a request for a DNA test is a procedural challenge rather than an agreement to conduct one. The question sat in the room. Hartwell looked at Eleanor. Osi looked at Eleanor. Brennan was writing. I want to protect the integrity of this company, Eleanor said. A request like this, in the current regulatory environment, creates vulnerabilities that Mrs. Whitfield, Osi said, and his voice was mild and absolutely final. The petition is properly filed. The charter provision is clear. My view is that we should proceed. They voted at 10:40. The succession review would proceed. Independent DNA confirmation would be conducted by a laboratory selected by the board secretary from a pre-approved list of independent testing facilities. Results to be delivered within 48 hours of sample submission. 6 votes in favor, 2 abstentions. Eleanor did not vote. She sat at the head of the table and looked at the result with the expression of a woman processing a development she had not planned for. Not devastated, Eleanor was not capable of visible devastation, but present in the room with the specific quality of someone for whom the floor has shifted and who has not yet located the new position. Mara looked at her across the table. What she felt, looking at Eleanor Whitfield across a boardroom table, was something closer to sorrow than anything else. Not sorrow for Eleanor, or not only. Sorrow for the architecture of a thing that had required this much effort to maintain. For the decades of arrangement and management and careful language deployed in the service of keeping a truth buried that, once exposed, was simply a truth. Her father had had 2 children. One of them had been hidden. That was the whole of it. Stripped of the corporate language and the legal architecture and the 30 years of decisions made to prevent this from happening. It had happened anyway. Mara, Eleanor said. Everyone else in the room had moved, attorneys conferring, Reed gathering documents, Hartwell and O.C. in quiet conversation. Eleanor was looking at her directly, and for the first time in 3 years of knowing this woman, the expression on her face was not managed. "I did what I believed was necessary to protect what your father built," she said, quietly, just between them. "I did not hate you. I want you to understand that. What I did was not personal." Mara looked at her for a moment. "Everything you did was personal," she said. "You arranged a marriage without telling either of us the truth. You spent 3 years managing my life from 6 feet away. You put me in a room at 100 degrees Celsius." She kept her voice even and her eyes on Eleanor's. "It was entirely personal. The fact that you had business reasons does not make it anything else." Eleanor said nothing. "I don't require you to have hated me," Mara said. "I only require you to understand what you did." She picked up her folder and walked toward the east entrance. At the door she paused. "The first time you met me," she said, without turning around, "at the dinner Cole arranged, you recognized me." She waited. "Yes," Eleanor said, behind her, very quiet. "You looked at me, and you saw your husband's daughter, and you decided to bring me in close rather than keep me out." A pause. "It seemed safer to know where you were." Mara nodded slowly. "That was your first mistake," she said. "Getting close enough to see me clearly. Because once you saw me clearly, you should have understood what I was capable of." She walked out. The 48 hours that followed were the longest Mara had experienced since the night in the sauna. Not because of fear, not because of uncertainty about the outcome, but because the waiting itself had a quality that could not be managed or accelerated. It simply had to pass. She spoke to her mother on the phone for 2 hours on the first evening. The conversation was the most difficult she had ever had and also the most necessary. Her mother cried, which was something Mara had never seen. Her mother was not a woman who showed that register. And hearing it over the phone was like hearing a frequency she had not known existed. Her mother told her about Robert, not with bitterness, not with the accumulated grievance of a woman cataloging a wrong, but with the careful honesty of someone releasing a thing they have been holding for a very long time, testing each sentence to make sure it was true before saying it. He had loved her, she said, in the way of a man who also loved his other life, which is not a complete love, but it was real. He had wanted to acknowledge the children. He had been told, in language that left no room for negotiation, what the cost of that would be. He chose his other life, her mother said. I won't pretend that was anything other than what it was, but I also won't pretend he didn't struggle with it. I saw him struggle with it. And then I asked him to leave because watching a man struggle with whether to choose you is its own kind of damage. I should have told you, her mother said. Yes, Mara said, but I understand why you didn't. You have his eyes, her mother said. I noticed it from the beginning and I never said it. You have his exact eyes. Mara also received a text from Cole that evening. I'm not asking to see you. I know the timing. I wanted to say one thing and you can ignore it if you need to. She read it and waited. I have been a coward in ways that had consequences for you. Not because I was told to be. Because it was easier than what the alternative required. I am not telling you this to ask for anything. I am telling you because you deserve to hear me say it in plain language without the managed version. She read it twice. Then she put the phone down and thought about it for a long time. She thought about the emails he had brought her, the 3 days he had apparently spent not sleeping, The way he had stood in Daniel's doorway with no jacket and no prepared expression, which was the most honest she had ever seen him look. She did not text back. She was not ready to text back, but she held the message in a part of her that was not yet certain of its position and let it sit there. The second result arrived on a Friday morning at 11:20. Clara Strand called Reed, who called Mara, who was sitting in Daniel's kitchen drinking tea and watching a sparrow on the window ledge. Confirmed, Reed said, 99.94%. The independent lab's result is consistent with the 1,999 test. The documentation is complete. Mara put the phone down. She sat for a while. Daniel appeared in the doorway with his coat on, carrying a paper bag that smelled of the bakery 2 blocks away. He looked at her face and set the bag down and sat across from her. "Reed called me too," he said. She nodded. "How do you feel?" She thought about it honestly. Like something that has been very heavy for a long time has been put down, she said. And like the relief of putting it down is different from knowing what to do next. You don't have to know what to do next today. I know, she said, but I know what I want to do next. The board reconvened on Friday afternoon. This time Eleanor was not present. Her attorneys were. The result was read into the record. The succession review proceeded in the orderly, procedural language of a body that had been given a clear determination and was doing the necessary work of implementing it. 40% of Whitfield Holdings' equity structure, as specified in Robert Whitfield's corporate charter under the provision for biological heirs, would be formally assessed and transferred to Mara's holding entity over a transition period to be determined. Hartwell moved to accelerate the timeline. OC seconded. Brennan voted yes. Mara sat at the east side of the table and watched it happen with the steady attention of a woman who has not quite internalized yet that a thing she set in motion 5 days ago is in the process of becoming real. After the meeting, she stood in the corridor outside the boardroom with Daniel for a moment. "Are you okay?" he asked. She considered it. "I think so. I think I will be." "That's the right answer." "Is it? It's a true answer," he said. "That's better." She looked at her brother for a moment and thought about all the times since the hospital, since the kitchen table with the prenuptial agreement at midnight, since the phone call with their mother that he had done this, offered her the true thing instead of the comfortable thing, at the exact moment she needed it. "Thank you," she said. He looked slightly embarrassed. "You did this," he said. "We did this," she said. "Don't be modest. You found the file. You read the document at midnight and figured out how to use it against the person who wrote it. We're both impressive," she said. "The point stands." He almost smiled. Cole was waiting outside the building, not in a car, not at a distance directly outside, on the sidewalk, in the November cold without a coat, in a way that suggested he had been there for a while and had not planned ahead. He saw her come through the revolving door and took 3 steps toward her and then stopped, which was the right thing to do, not pressing, waiting to see if she would close the distance. She looked at him. She thought about the question she had been carrying since Thursday morning. Not the question of whether he had done what she knew he had done that was a fact, settled, not negotiable, and not in need of examination. The question of what came next. Not for the company, not for the legal proceedings. The question of what came next for the two of them, in the specific and human sense of 2 people who had met in a gallery hallway and had built something and had also broken it, and who were now standing on a sidewalk in the cold with a child between them who was going to need answers to questions neither of them had yet learned to ask. She crossed the distance. Not all of it. She stopped close enough to talk without the street noise making it difficult. And she looked at him. And she said, "I'm going to need you to tell me everything, not the managed version. Not the version where you protected yourself from the parts that made you look worst. Everything, in the order it happened, including what you knew and when you knew it, and what you chose and what you were told to choose." "Yes," he said. "And then I'm going to need time. Not a timeline. Actual time. As long as it takes. Which might be very long. I understand. And what you earn back, if you earn anything back, is going to be earned through things you actually do. Not things you say." She held his gaze. "I spent 3 years letting what you said override what I saw. I'm done with that particular trade. You should be done with it," he said. "I should have been the person who didn't ask you to make it." "The baby," Mara said. "Whatever happens between us, that's not contingent on anything. You're going to be the father he or she has access to. You're going to show up." "I know," he said. "I'm going to show up. And I'm going to let what that means be defined by what I actually do." She looked at him for a moment longer. "Okay," she said. It was not forgiveness. She was not ready for forgiveness, might not be ready for a very long time. Might arrive somewhere that was not forgiveness, but was its own kind of settlement between what had happened and what came next. But it was a door. Not fully open, ajar, in the way that a door left ajar communicates that it has not been locked. She turned and walked back to where Daniel was waiting. 3 weeks later, on a Tuesday morning in November, Mara lay on an examination table in a brightly lit room and looked at a screen on the wall. Her regular doctor, Dr. Chen, who had been her OB since week 8, and whom she had returned to the moment she was out of the Whitfield estate, stood beside the ultrasound equipment with the calm efficiency of a woman who has done this thousands of times and has not stopped finding it remarkable. Daniel was in the chair against the wall, in the position he always occupied, close, present, allowing the space to belong to whoever needed it. The image appeared on the screen. Mara looked at her child, 29 weeks now. The image was the particular grainy architecture of ultrasound, that strange and beautiful technology that renders the not yet visible in shades of gray, that shows you the shape of a person before the person is fully formed. She could see the curve of a head, the suggestion of fingers, the unmistakable movement of a tiny chest expanding and contracting in the rhythm that meant present, healthy, indifferent to the extraordinary circumstances of its arrival. The heartbeat came through the speakers, steady, deliberate, the same rhythm it had maintained through everything. Through the sauna and the hospital and the boardroom and the sidewalk outside the Whitfield Holdings Tower, and every night that Mara had lain awake in Daniel's spare room sorting through the wreckage and the architecture of what she intended to build instead. She had come through something. She had not come through it unaltered. That was not how coming through things worked. Whatever the language of resilience suggested, she had come through it as herself, which was a different proposition. She had come through it as Mara Huang, who was also Robert Whitfield's daughter, and who was also a woman who had spent 3 years being managed and had spent 5 days refusing to be, and who was going to spend the rest of her life doing the harder, slower work of building something that did not require management because it was actually true. She thought about her mother, who had agreed to come to New York for the birth and who had cried a second time on the phone when Mara told her, and had then said, in the voice of a woman recalibrating a position she had held for 28 years, I should have told you earlier, but I want you to know that I don't regret raising you the way I did. The woman you are doesn't come from what you didn't have. It comes from what you did. She thought about Cole, who had been showing up, quietly and without announcement, attending the appointments she said he could attend, being present in the way he had always been poor at present, without agenda, without management, without the performed warmth that substituted for actual presence. It was early. She was watching. She was not going to mistake watching for trusting, but he was showing up. She thought about the boardroom on Friday afternoon, the vote that had been cast, the clause on page 31 of a document written to contain her that had, instead, when she read it without the filter she had always used, become the instrument of her standing. She thought about what Thomas Reed had said when she thanked him after the meeting. Your father wrote that charter in the 90s. He wrote it with language broad enough to include a hypothetical he clearly considered possible. I don't know if that was planning or guilt or something in between, but it was there. He left a door. He had left a door. She had found it. She had walked through it. She had not done it alone. That was the thing she was still learning to hold. She had spent 3 years believing she was supposed to carry everything quietly and by herself, that asking for help was the thing that made you smaller. That silence was protection. Her mother had taught her that, with the best intentions available. Eleanor had exploited it, with no intentions at all except self-preservation. Cole had benefited from it without understanding what it was costing her. She was done with it. She had a brother who found things in files and asked questions and broke down doors without hesitating, and was currently sitting against the wall of this examination room with his arms crossed and his eyes on the screen and an expression of absolute ferocity disguised as calm. She had a lawyer who read every document twice and asked the question nobody else thought to ask. She had a woman named Carolyn Vance who had texted her at 11:15 on a Thursday night with information about board member seating arrangements. She had a child who had survived everything the first 29 weeks had offered. Everything looks excellent, Dr. Chen said, with the particular certainty of a woman who means it. Strong heartbeat, good position, right on track, Mara repeated. She looked at her child on the screen for a while, longer. She thought, I am going to give you everything I can. I am going to tell you the truth when you are ready for it, in the order you are ready for it. And I am going to let you ask the questions that need asking without flinching away from them. I am going to show you what it looks like when someone decides to see clearly, even when the view is difficult. And I am going to show you what it looks like to build something on an honest foundation instead of a comfortable one. She looked at Daniel. He was looking at the screen. He looked, in the light of the ultrasound room, like exactly what he was, the person who had been paying attention when no one else had been, who had broken down a door and asked the right questions and sat at a kitchen table at midnight and let her find her way through a difficult truth at her own pace. What are you going to name her? He asked, without looking away from the screen. Her, he turned. Dr. Chen mentioned the position about 10 minutes ago. You were thinking about other things. Dr. Chen smiled. She had not confirmed the sex. Mara had said she wanted to wait, but she did not correct Daniel either. Mara looked at the screen. A girl she had not known. And now she knew. And the knowledge settled into the space where it had been waiting with the completeness of a thing that was always going to be true. Maya, she said. Daniel looked at her. It starts with M, she said. And it means, depending on which tradition you're drawing from, it means dream, or illusion, or water. I like that it means different things in different contexts. She can decide which one fits when she's old enough to have a context. Her brother looked at the screen again. He was quiet for a moment, in the particular way he was quiet when he was feeling something he intended to keep. Maya Huang, he said. Maya Huang. She confirmed. The heartbeat continued on the speakers, steady and deliberate and entirely unimpressed by everything that had brought them to this room. Outside the window of the examination room, the November morning was doing what November mornings did: gray sky, bare trees, the city conducting its business with no regard for the people inside it. It was an ordinary morning in every way, except that in a bright room on the 4th floor of a medical building on the Upper West Side, a woman had just named her daughter and was looking at the proof that the daughter was real and was well, and was going to arrive in approximately 11 weeks into a world that was going to be, because her mother had made it so. Better than the one she had been born into. Not perfect. Better. That was enough. That was, all things considered, the only thing that had ever been enough. That was a start. A note at the end of this, about what kind of story it was. It was not a love story in the conventional sense. It did not end with reunification or with the clean finality of complete severance. It ended somewhere in the middle, where most real things end, with two people who had failed each other in most of the ways that matter, standing on opposite sides of a distance that had not yet been fully measured and might never be fully crossed, and choosing to show up anyway for the person who needed both of them. Mara Huang chose to see clearly. Not all at once. The seeing had been a process, slow and sometimes painful. The removal of a filter she had installed so long ago she had forgotten it was there. She had chosen it 3 years too late and 5 days before a boardroom. And that was the schedule it happened on, because that was the schedule she was ready for. And readiness is not something that can be arranged in advance. Cole Whitfield chose, eventually and at genuine cost, to stop being his mother's instrument. It had not been a dramatic conversion. It had been a Thursday morning with no jacket on a sidewalk in November, and an envelope of emails, and a question he asked himself in the dark of an apartment that had revealed itself to be nothing like what he had believed it was. He had a long way to go. He understood that. He was going. Eleanor Whitfield had no choices left. She had built a structure to contain something she could not control, and the structure had failed the way all structures built on the suppression of truth eventually fail, not explosively, but through the gradual accumulation of a record. And one woman who had learned to read it, Daniel Huang, had made a single choice that mattered more than any other. He had broken down a door without hesitating. Everything that followed had followed from that. He would spend a long time afterward not thinking of himself as having done anything extraordinary, which was itself an extraordinary quality in a person. And Maya, who had no role in any of this except to arrive in the middle of it and make its resolution necessary, was going to come into a world that had been rearranged before she was born by the fact of her existence. She was going to find, when she was old enough to look, a mother who had fought for her before she had a name and a father who was learning, in the particular grinding way that genuine change requires, how to be the person she deserved. The inheritance that mattered was not the 40%, not the boardroom, or the clause, or the procedural resolution. The inheritance that mattered was a woman who could see clearly and was willing to say what she saw, handed to a daughter who would grow up watching her do it, until doing it herself seemed like the only natural option. That is not a small thing. That is, in fact, the whole thing. The truth cost more than anyone expected and produced more than anyone could have predicted from outside it. It ended where real things end, not with a final image of triumph or grief, but with an ordinary Tuesday morning and a heartbeat on a screen, and the name of a person who had not yet arrived but was already, undeniably, on her way. That was enough. That was, all things considered, more than enough. That was a start.